and welcome to Thumbing Through Yesterday, the podcast where we pull our favorite novels down off the shelf, dust them off, and remind ourselves why we love them so much. My name's Tom Galley. Joining me today, we've got Tony Pasculi.
Thanks again, Tom.
And what do we have in store for ourselves today?
Today we have Ender's Game by Orson Scott Card, science fiction classic from, I want to say, 1978. I should have looked that up.
77.
77. Oh, off by a year.
This was a new read for me.
Yeah, so I'm really curious to get your opinion on this because this has been one of my favorite books for a long time. And in fact, not just this book, but its sequel, which in my mind, is one of the greatest science fiction novels of all time.
Well, I'm looking forward to reading that one as well. I watched the movie Ender's Game on an airplane, and it was like, when you've gotten to that zone where your brain isn't working, but you can't sleep. So, this is the third or fourth bad film in a row that I've watched on the airplane. And as I read this, I really regretted the fact that I had seen that film because it gave away things that would have been a delight to have discovered as I was reading it.
Yeah.
I do want to thank you for introducing me to a property that's the gateway to a 20-book universe. I'm going to be working my way through this for quite a while. Okay, I'm exaggerating. They're currently 18, but there are 2 in development. And certainly by the time I've finished reading number 18, at least one of those 2 will have come to fruition.
Yeah, that's interesting. There's sort of 3 distinct series within this universe. There's Ender's Game. There's the Ender Sextet, which starts with Ender's Game. And then the sequel, Speaker for the Dead, and then Card sort of squeaks another book in between the first and second book, and then there are 3 more that come after. But then he goes and he tells the same story again from the perspective of one of the other characters, Bean, who you meet in Ender's Game.
We did.
He tells a parallel story called Ender's Shadow, where we experience most of the same events along mostly the same tie line, but from Bean's perspective. So it's a really fascinating way to jump back into it, and sort of, if you loved it the first time, you'll love it again the second time. And of course, because it's Bean instead of Ender, it goes off in a completely different direction with the following books. And then the other sequence is what's happening back on Earth while all this is going on out in space with Ender. Following the story of his older brother Peter for the most part. Yeah,
that was a fascinating development, the way the brother and the sister turned out.
Yeah. So it sounds like you liked it. If you're planning to read, 17 more books.
Well, I have a hold on Speaker for the Dead. I'm actually going to, when we leave here today, I'm going to swing by Chemical Library and pick that up. So
fantastic.
I'm committed to at least reading the next one.
Yeah. So we talk about favorite books, and I would say that Speaker for the Dead is actually my favorite book in this sequence, but it's not a good entry point to the series, unfortunately. And I didn't want to make you read 2 books so we could talk about one.
I appreciate the consideration there.
But Speaker for the Dead is the heart and soul of this whole sequence, I think. And it's what makes the book so significant to me. And he only sort of starts to touch on those themes in Speaker at the very, very end of Ender's Game. And of course, they're completely eliminated from the movie, which is just a double tragedy. So I think you're going to enjoy that one also. But as for Ender's Game itself, what did you enjoy about it? What did you like about it?
Well, this is certainly another example of your competent man trope, and of my observation that these are the most competent children, not just the most competent people I've ever met. I mean, Ender's 6 when he begins his career with the military, and he's 9 by the time he has the. No, I think he's all of 11 or 12 by the time he has the final climactic battle there.
Yeah.
Overall, clearly, I really did enjoy this book. It was a fun read. I had to keep being reintroduced to the fact that we were talking about children, right? Because in my mind, Ender is a young adult, just because of the physical feats they describe him doing and his classmates doing, and the level of intellectual processing he's doing. It doesn't seem realistic for it to be a child, but that they make a point of saying these are exceptional children. So there's, I just have to keep being reintroduced. In my mind's eye, that is not what I'm seeing. I'm not seeing a bunch of children on the space station. I'm seeing a bunch of late teens.
What Card talks about this in his introduction, and is one of the things that was important to him in writing this book was that these are children, and children are smart, and that people often underestimate them. in significant ways, and particularly intellectually. I've met children that are this bright, and that they're not that rare. I think what is rare, and I think this does come across in the book, is that Ender has an emotional maturity that the other children don't have. And he's able to harness his intellect in a way that they are not. They are able to apply their intelligence to following the rules. Yeah, there are like a lot of bright children that most of the children in battle school, you tell them what the game is, and they will play the game, and they will try to win, and they are very, very good at that. And Ender is always thinking one step ahead. He's like, this is the game they want me to play, but what is the actual game? Ender's playing the metagame throughout. Not always successfully. And that's what sets him apart from the other kids. Actually, his brother and sister are playing the metagame also.
They all seem to be functioning more or less as peers.
Yeah.
It's just like you said, the emotional balance is why they selected Ender rather than his siblings.
We should talk about a little bit of setup for the book. We have the context is that humanity is at war with a race called the Buggers, which, sorry, British audience, that's a very rude word, deliberately chosen because they are bug-like aliens that invaded Earth, and humanity barely managed to fend them off in the first Bugger War. And now, 70 years later, they are on their way back to the Bugger homeworld to finish the war, because they don't know if they're going to come back. They have never managed to establish a way to communicate with them. And so humanity has been drafting the best and the brightest of its children and putting them through this intense battle school, starting from a very, very early age, like 6 years old. And they're supposed to graduate, I believe. The intention is they're supposed to graduate at 18. They're supposed to be adults when they graduate, which makes sense. And because of the timing of the war, it turns out that Ender is their best hope, and he happens to be 12 when the fleet reaches the Bugger homeworld. So,
yep, which he is completely unaware of.
Oh yeah. Oh, spoilers for the book.
And this is why I genuinely regret the fact that I watched that movie, aside from the fact that it's simply a bad movie and there wasn't much to enjoy. But as I'm reading about Ender's exploits and whatnot, I know what's happening. I know the fact that these things that he thinks are simulations are not, that he's actually, commanding genuine spaceships with genuine crew members against genuine aliens.
So this is the game of the title, that Ender thinks he's playing a simulation in order to learn how to defeat the Bugger fleet. But in fact, sort of towards the end of his training, they actually put him in charge of actual ships, which are in actual combat. And the mistakes he makes are costing actual lives, and they choose not to tell him this.
Yep.
And until they have actually won the war, and he's wiped out the Bugger home planet, killing the entire species, becoming the greatest genocide in the history of humanity.
In the history of at least two races that we know of.
Two races, yeah. And then they tell him, it's like, that's it, you're done. There's no more training because you won the war. Yeah.
Yep. So, this is, and predictably, this devastates the kid. The idea of he doesn't even know what number to attach to the lives that he has cost, both human and Bugger. Mm-hmm. So I'm really curious to see what happens as we open up in Speaker for the Dead. And I love the choice of the name there.
Yeah, it's interesting because I don't think it is predictable. And I think, a conventional sort of science fiction trope would be to just go, yay, we won. If Starship Troopers, there's no moralizing about wiping out the Buggers.
But what we have here with Ender is throughout the book, he has intensely regretted any time he's hurt somebody, and he gets these situations, 3 or 4 notable ones where he has to genuinely hurt somebody, to extract himself from a situation that's never his fault, right? So we have that insight into him. He doesn't want to hurt people, and he says this over and over again, I don't want to hurt anybody.
But he's willing to. That's what makes him different from his brother and his sister. His brother is a straight-up sociopath who tortures animals, exhibits other attributes of sociopathy, and that's why he is not chosen for battle school. And his sister, who's just as bright as Ender, is too compassionate, and that's why she's not chosen. And Ender is the one who's chosen because he has this deep well of empathy. He doesn't want to cause any more harm than he has to. At the same time, he is willing to do what's necessary to finish the fight.
Yep.
So I think the opening scene in the book is he gets in a fight. All the kids who are candidates for battle school wear a monitor, so their every action and thought is monitored. And he gets his monitor taken out, and that makes him a target for the bullies now. Mm-hmm. And he gets into a fight, and he's surrounded by 6 kids, and he's the smallest one. And he knocks his kid down. He says, "I have to finish this fight now because his kids are going to come up. He's going to come after me again tomorrow. I have to end this fight." And he kicks him while he's down. And he gets in trouble for that at the time. They're like, "You kicked a kid while he was down. How could you do that? You're a monster." And he says, "I did what I had to do."
Yep.
So, and that's why they pick him. Yeah. There's been essays written about this book, which I think look at it from a very ungenerous perspective. And I think that perspective is motivated by a distaste for Orson Scott Card's politics. That's my supposition, because I don't think it's warranted at all that Enster is actually a monster, and that he's, that Card is trying to portray him in a sympathetic light that is undeserved. And I don't think that's the case at all. I think Ender is someone who every step of the way is lied to, who's treated very badly, and yet has this incredible core of humanity in him that is deeply, profoundly empathetic and takes on a burden that is not his responsibility whatsoever. And he makes it his responsibility. And that is where the name Speaker for the Dead comes from. He writes a book about the Hive Queen. The Hive Queen is the intelligent sort of creature that controls I'm spoiling another aspect of the book. Basically, he wipes out this entire race, but he imagines he's in conversation with the intelligence behind this race, and writes to his frustration that they were never able to establish a communication in life, and paints a very empathetic portrayal of that race. Yeah.
Now that there were a few things about this book that bothered me, and this is actually one of the larger ones. And this doesn't come into play until we get to the end, right? After he's, I don't know whether to call it a vision, a hallucination. He has this experience where he believes he's in contact with the aliens.
Yes.
And there's some objective truth to this, because you see that they physically constructed a manifestation of something he experienced in a virtual simulation, right?
Yes.
This village nested in the decaying body of a giant. Yeah. But there is no, at least thus far, there is no even attempt at explaining how this alien race has infiltrated human technology years before the ultimate conflict, where the fleet is in proximity with them again, and managed to send cognizant messages to Ender. Yeah. It got really mystic at the end for a science fiction novel.
Interesting. That is addressed in a science fictional context in the second book, although it becomes
I thought it might be forthcoming.
More mystical. There's a technology in the book called the Ansible, which I think is borrowed from Ursula K. Le Guin, which allows faster than or instantaneous communication across interstellar distances, which would be challenging for us to do. As far as we know, that's impossible. But in the book, it's possible. And it's this same technology. And this technology, the Ansible, is what they acquire from the buggers. So humans don't develop that. They acquire that after they defeat the bugger fleet, the initial bugger invasion fleet.
Indirectly, right? Because for the buggers, it's a biological feature. It's simply inherent in their physiology.
Yes.
But they give humanity the knowledge that it's a possibility.
Yes.
And given that it is a certainty it can be done, humanity goes on to do it.
So that turns out to be the key for how the Hive Queen can communicate with Ender, is using the same mechanism of the Ansible by somehow finding a bridge between the bugger's biological mechanism and humanity's technological manifestation of the same idea. And it's referenced a couple of times very obliquely in the book. And I think these are edits that were made later on, because I don't remember reading them the first time. phylotic technology. I don't know if you remember.
I remember the word fleeting by and wondering, this is one of the moments I wished I was reading on a Kindle so I could poke the word and see what popped up.
It's a made-up word. It would not pop up.
Well, there we go.
Yeah. So I think that's something that Card dropped in later, once he sort of figured out the mechanism in the second book and then went back and put it into the first book, even though it doesn't really contribute to your reading the first time through. So there's a thing you'll come across in the second book called phylotes, and that's where all of this sort of starts to make more sense. Yeah.
This isn't like midichlorians, is it?
It is not like midichlorians. Well, I don't know. Maybe you'll think it will. It does start to get... It does have a science fictional sort of explanation for things, but it does get kind of mystical at the same time too. So you may reject it for that reason. I don't know. Yeah.
Yeah, we'll find out somewhere down the road.
Yeah. My objection to midichlorians is that they came along far too late and were unnecessary. Yeah. If you had started with midichlorians in the first movie, it would have been fine.
It's a retcon that exists for no reason. And how can this possibly have been lost knowledge?
Yeah.
Right? I mean, particularly when you actually have one of the Jedi who was around in the days when midichlorian testing was commonplace, still walking around and teaching people. Well, okay, teaching person.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, let's not get started on the Star Wars prequels. Be here all day.
Indeed, indeed. There was one other thing that I had a little bit of trouble with, disliked about the book. And this is a much smaller thing, but there are 4 or 5 passages in there, at least ones that stuck out in my mind, where he goes to elaborate lengths to really carefully describe something that's happening, a series of actions or the topography of a room or something like that. And very clearly in his mind, he sees what's happening and has done his very best to wring it out in words. And yet when I read these excruciatingly detailed, meticulous descriptions, they don't make sense to me.
Interesting.
So one that comes to mind is while he's at battle school, again, he's jumped by bullies in the shower. And again, he's able with his words to convince the one lead bully to face him mano a mano. And in Ender's head, there's things going on. One of the things is surely the adults are going to step in and save me, which they're not. Yeah. But the other thing is we are fighting in a gravity environment. I can really hurt him and I can really get hurt in here. So then he describes how Ender attacks this larger young man. Ender has got his back against the wall of the shower. He pushes off with his hands and his feet, strikes the bully in his chest, bounces off the bully's stomach, lands above his head, turns around, and who's now down, kicks him. And while this might actually have worked in a zero-G environment where he's ricocheting around like a pinball, right? If you're standing, you've got your back against the wall, you use powerful limbs to push off, I can see that you could leap and Bruce Lee style get both feet in front of you to kick somebody in the chest, at which point you would both fall on your asses to the ground. There wouldn't be any landing on your feet on his stomach or bouncing and landing above his head so you could turn around and kick him. You know, and there are 4 or 5 passages in the book where he really goes out of his way to describe a series of events or the layout of a space. And it seems like whatever he's seen in his head and whatever's coming out of his fingertips are just out of sync. It's a Manini thing to pick on.
I don't remember that passage bothering me. I was more wrapped up in the emotional content of that scene. So
yeah, clearly I'm focusing on the wrong thing. I mean,
no, not necessarily, because that's one of those things that it speaks to the skill as a writer is as you're painting a consistent picture with. You don't want to spell everything out, so too much detail is distracting, but at the same time, a lack of detail is underwhelming.
Well, and some of it, particularly in the battle room, as they're describing, Ender's revolutionary tactics.
Yeah.
It doesn't work if you aren't explicit about it.
Yes.
The fact that you're going to fold your legs in front of you and zap them with the gun so they stay immobile without your having to think about it and then use them as a shield to shoot between. You can't really gloss over that level of detail.
Yeah. So the battle room sequences work for you?
Almost all of them. Okay. There was one where, again, what he was trying to describe and what I'm picturing in my mind didn't work. And it had to do with them sliding around the side of the room to get behind the opposing forces.
That one stood out to me also. It's kind of like I'm having a hard time visualizing this, what it means to slide along the wall. Because how are you maintaining contact with the wall?
Exactly. We're in 0G. We've got no propulsion, right? So
Yeah.
Well, anyway.
For the most part, though, I love those sequences. One of the great disappointments in the movie is you'd think that, what you expect from bankrupt Hollywood adaptation is that they're just going to focus specifically on the battles, and the battle rooms are the core of the book. And I think there's one battle room sequence in the movie.
Yep.
And it's just underwhelming. And whereas Card clearly put a lot of thought into this, and I think the battle room sequences are very, very bright. Very well constructed. He actually is a huge fan of military history. So he studied quite a bit. He read quite a bit. And he thought about, I think one of the origins of the initial story, Ender's Game was a story before it was a novel. And as he was reading a book of a military strategy, and he said, well, how would this translate to space? Mm-hmm. Because you don't have a battlefield in the same way. You're going to have a three-dimensional context, and that's going to be very disorienting for people who grew up in a two-dimensional context of using that third dimension effectively. This is something they pay lip service to in one of the Star Trek movies, where they briefly rise above the plane.
Wrath of Khan.
Yep. And since it's literally the only time it happens in any of the movies, it's just like, it's nonsense. It doesn't convince me. Because it's like, oh, he's a 2D person living in a 3D world now. We can take advantage of him. It's like, why haven't you been doing this the entire time? Why wasn't it not your entire battle tactics? Yeah. And that's exactly what Card does. He creates this battle room, which is designed to get people to think in 3 dimensions. He actually has this is in the introduction. The reason for the battle room is the essence of training is to allow error without consequence. 3-dimensional warfare would need to be practiced in an enclosed space, so mistakes wouldn't send trainees flying off to Jupiter. Need a way to practice shooting without risk of injury, yet trainees were hit and need to be disabled, at least temporarily. The environment would need to be changeable to simulate different conditions of warfare. And we need to have some of the confusion of a real battle, so play combat didn't evolve into something as rigid and formal as the meaningless marching and maneuvers that still waste an astonishing amount of time of a trainee's time in boot camp. So that's an entire paragraph from the introduction. So he was thinking about this, and bam, the entire story came to him, and he wrote that story, published it, and I think it didn't win a Hugo Award, but it won what was then called the John W. Campbell Award for Best New Writer. Mm-hmm. And then he decided to turn it into a book. And I think the book he was originally wanted to write was Speaker for the Dead. He didn't get a chance to touch on those themes in the story as much. And he realized that to write Speaker for the Dead, he really had to turn Ender's Game into a full book to do it justice. And so it only, again, comes up in a very, very small coda at the end of the book, this whole idea of the Speaker for the Dead. Yeah.
Yeah. Now, I love, there are 2 things about the battle room that I found puzzling just from an outside Tom logic perspective. One of which is presumably this battle room training has been going on for a while.
Yeah.
If nothing else, we've already got 17-year-olds that are there when 6-year-old Ender joins. So I mean, at least it's been going on for a decade.
Yeah.
Presumably, it's been going on for much longer than that, since the first or the second Bugger War, right? And in all that time, it never occurred to anybody that pointing their feet towards the enemy reduced their profile and their chance of getting killed. It just seems unlikely to me, right? Because in modern 2D warfare, you lie down flat given the opportunity, right? So that you've minimized your profile. You don't, if you're not a British redcoat, you don't simply walk upright towards a firing enemy. So that was a bit of a stretch, it seemed to me, that Ender was the first person to genuinely decide I could make a smaller profile and I could present less critical parts of my body to damage.
I think that's legitimate criticism, and I have a response to it. But I also think it's legit that no one would have thought of the idea of tucking the legs and freezing those.
I'm willing to bet that if you want to give him the evolution of the idea, but the fact that nobody ever thought of that.
So now I'm going to back up and defend the first idea. So the second idea I think is legitimately his, and the first idea we give him credit for a couple of reasons. One, it's really, really hard to write smart characters. And I don't know how smart Orson Scott Card is. I imagine he's pretty bright, because again, this is a terrific novel. This won the Hugo and the Nebula the year it came out, and then its sequel won the Hugo and the Nebula the year it came out. The first books in history to win a book and a sequel win the Hugo and the Nebula award. So he's obviously a bright guy, but is he as bright as Ender? I mean, was he that smart at 6 years old? Maybe not. Maybe not. So you have to cheat a little bit to create bright characters.
I can totally understand why we want that character to be the one who is evolutionary. And I can also understand that maybe there's not a more evolutionary, revolutionary idea that he could come up with, that Ender, could have taken credit for rather than what seems relatively obvious.
Yeah. So there's two other defenses I'll make. And one is that as I was reading this book, it didn't occur to me at the time, well, if I was fighting this battle, this is what I would do. So Ender, as I was reading it, Ender was always a step ahead of me in his tactics. I was never going, come on, why don't you just do this? So to me, that made him sufficiently smart. If you came up with that objection on your first read through, I would say that's pretty astute. Yeah.
I will go so far as to say that if I were put in the battle room, not having read Ender's Game, it would probably not be my first thought to orient my feet towards the bad guys and use my legs as a shield.
But you would expect someone to come up with it eventually.
I would expect it to be something that evolved fairly quickly and to already be relatively standard. The other thing that bothered me a bit about the battle rooms is that we spend so much time. I mean, it's critical to the evolution, but what they're training people to do is fight in a space battle with ships. Yeah. And yet the vast majority of their early training, right, they don't graduate until they're 16 or 17 to move on to the starship training under normal circumstances. They're stuck in infantry combat training from the time they're 6 to the time they graduate, which I think is 17. And then after that, Ender was an exception because the fleet got where it was going. He only had a couple of years to adapt to that. I don't know what that length of training normally would have been. But it seems like an inordinate amount of time to spend on infantry maneuvers when the focus of the war is going to be starship maneuvers.
I have a justification for that too, which is that what they're really training, they're doing two things at once. They're training and they're weeding. So they're looking for people, but they're also instilling skills. And the skills have to be instilled with something. And what they're really looking is for someone who can break the meta. That's what they want. The Ender's the one who comes along and breaks the meta. And so when he is fighting, they have to keep changing the rules on him. They let the other army in first, which is the first time they ever do that to opposing army, and he has to figure out that.
And he's brilliant in that moment.
Yes. They have him fight two armies at once. They throw all kinds of unfair stuff at him because they're not teaching him skills of they're not teaching the infantry skills. That's not what they care about. What they care about is the evolution of his thinking as a commander. Yeah. So that's what's really going on. That's the meta game that they're playing with Ender.
If you take Ender out of this, if you look at the operation of the battle school pre-Ender, presumably what you've had is these armies going at each other the same way for a decade before they get promoted.
Yeah.
And maybe you're right. Maybe had any of them, as you say, challenged the meta, maybe they would have been moved through more expediently. These people are kept in there for so long, not actually as much training as they are to be chaff. And you're looking for the grains of wheat to rise to the surface.
That's a little bit of it, yeah. As you need people to compete against, so you have to have a certain sort of universe of opponents. And they're looking also for the people who will rise up out of that sea and be the standouts. But also they want to, you have to learn your tactics and your strategy somewhere and your leadership skills. So they're learning all of those things while they're learning this simplified environment, simplified and contained environment. And then they can move them up to more complex challenges. So I think that's the idea there. Yeah. They weren't expecting a commander to come out at 6 years old. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Or even 11 or 12. They're expecting someone to be 18 or 19 who's going to lead the fleet. So Ender gets through this whole process very, very quickly. So he spends a relatively large amount of time in battle school and a relatively small amount of time in command school. I think he's only in command school for a year?
I think it might be 2 years.
2 years?
It's definitely a short time.
It's very, very quick. And then he thinks he's still in command school, but he's actually in real battles at that point.
Yep.
Yeah. So I think that's the reasoning behind the the emphasis on battle school, on the infantry scale tactics. Yeah.
Now, one of the things I genuinely loved about this book is every chapter starts with a little page and a half, maybe 2 pages of a dialogue between, and sometimes we're given to know who the 2 characters are, and sometimes we're left to guess who the 2 characters are.
Yeah.
But it's this pseudo meta dialogue. It's the people outside of Ender's training who are trying to shape or trying to protect him. And yet, even in that context, from this almost omniscient exterior thing, we the readers aren't given a critical piece of information. That had I not watched that stupid movie on the airplane, I would have been at the end of the book along with everybody else before I discovered what was really happening with Ender.
Yeah.
And I think that's just brilliant. The fact that we actually have this, view from the outside. And although there's a couple of vague references to, things are happening soon and we don't have much time and other dire but meaningless predictions like that, we aren't given to understand exactly how pressing this deadline is.
I really like those dialogues too. I like them for the lack of attribution, which creates a lot of mystery. It's like, who are these people who are talking about Ender? As you say, we come to know that one of them often is Graf.
Often. I'm not sure he's in every conversation.
I'm not sure that he is either. And then, I lost my train of thought. I'll come back to me.
I do love the fact that, the Graf, who is the whip, right, in Ender's training, absolutely hates what he's doing.
Yeah.
He completely wishes he did not have to do this to the boy, but like Ender himself, he sees that there is no choice. It must be done, and he is the one that must do it. And he simply can't let anybody else interfere with that.
Yeah. There's one of my favorite quotes, this is highlighted, is I think it comes from one of those conversations. One of the other person who is not Graf, who is talking to at that moment, says, you've set him up so that he can't have any friends. You've isolated him. And Graf says he can have friends. It's parents he can't have. What he can't have is someone who will step in and say, it's going to be okay. It doesn't fall all on your shoulders. The weight of the world doesn't rest on you. You are not responsible. Everything they do takes that away from him. There's no outlet. There's no safety net. The weight of the world is on his shoulders, not the weight of the entire actual world, which it turns out, yes, it is. But of his life, of his friends' lives, of anyone he has to defend, no one's going to step in and save him. And that is a deliberate tactic on the part of the people who are running the battle school, is to make him feel that way, which is, on the one hand, incredibly cruel. On the other hand, incredibly necessary. It's also, it's fascinating because I don't think Card wrote these as YA books, and they are often treated as YA books because the age of the protagonist. Right. I'm amazed that they work as well as YA books as they seem to do for people, because they seem to be very adult themes to me. But one of the recurring themes of a YA book is that you strip away the authority figure somehow. That's why the first thing that always happens in a Disney movie is the parents die.
Right.
Yeah, so the kids have agency. There's no parent who's going to step in and save them. That's exactly what they do here. They take him away from his parents. They take him away from any authority figures, and so he's on his own. So he has the ultimate agency, except that he doesn't, because they're lying to him throughout the entire book.
I don't see how you could. I mean, again, other than the fact that Ender is a child, you're right. This does not have the themes you would think of as a young adult property. You don't have. Okay, so we started with the Disney thing. Parents are stripped out of there. The answer in a Disney movie is not to have the princess kill somebody and then not punish them for it, right? And this happens. Ender, in his way up, he kills 2 people in self-defense, and he doesn't know that he killed either of them, at least not initially. In resorting to this level of brute violence, which he resorts to reluctantly and only in the greatest need, and I think justifiably, but that is not the sort of message you find embedded in a YA book.
Well, I think there's been an evolution, or I want to say a devolution of YA books over the last several decades, where we think that kids have to have a representative of their age in the book, and it has to be goofy, and it has to be fun, and it has to be silly, and it has to be an adventure. It doesn't have to be dark, and it doesn't have to be serious. And that wasn't my experience growing up at all. I wanted to read serious books. I was reading adult books as soon as I get my hands on them. This is something a lot of science fiction readers encounter, actually, is, they get turned loose in the science fiction section because it's like, oh, rocket ships and ray guns. And the parents, my parents at least, hadn't read a lot of science fiction. They had no idea what I was reading. I was reading Dune when I was in 6th grade.
Yep.
Right? I was reading books with, oh my God, I read Stranger in a Strange Land way too early with its intense sexual themes. And I was like, I was not ready for that. You get exposed to these things, and I didn't need the books I was reading to have young protagonists in them, and I didn't need them to be light, fluffy adventure stories. I read The Great Escape when I was in middle school also, and other books along those lines about prisoners of war and stuff like that. Ate it up. Didn't need a high school age protagonist at all. So I think, and I was often underestimated in my reading tastes. It's like I went to a bookstore with a friend. And it's like, here, I said, I want to read this book. And they're like, no, that's too old for you. I'm going to get you this book instead. It's like, oh, no, please. Yeah. So that's sort of changed. This would have been perfectly suited to me to read at that time when I was Ender's age. I would have eaten this up. And so I'm glad that kids now are getting a chance to read it and appreciate it, even though it is not aimed at kids. But that doesn't mean that kids can't appreciate it. All right. Anything else? Anything else on Ender's Game?
I don't know how I've made it this far in life without having read this book before. I've heard people talk about it. I can actually remember being at a party in college and this book coming up. And one of my good friends at the time was just so excited. He was describing to me how this kid had this brilliant tactic of fighting in zero G, which included lying down flat and shooting over their feet. Mm-hmm. This came back to me as I was reading this. That would have been late 80s, early 90s. So it was probably the book was newish at the time.
Yeah. It took me a while before I picked this book up. I remember I was in college and it was always on the bookshelf. I'd always see it there with those stars on the cover. Like you've got your paperback here. It says, Hugo Award winner, Nebula. Mm-hmm. It's like, clearly this is a good book, but something about the cover just didn't grab me. And eventually I read it, not because anything about it spoke to me, because it was a notable book. It was an awarded book. It must have something going for it. So eventually I was like, okay, fine, I'll take a turn on this one. And then like you, I was like, why did it take me so long to read this book? This book is amazing. Yeah. It's fallen out of favor recently, unfortunately, because of Orson Scott Card's politics. Orson Scott Card is not a popular author these days. He's got an unfortunate take on gay marriage. He's Mormon, and he's very outspoken about the fact. And it's a real tragedy because I think he's written he writes a political column for a magazine. Mm-hmm. I don't know if he still does. And it's terrible. It's just bad. It doesn't have nearly insight or empathy that his books do. And I think these things get circulated and there's a lot of hate for him. Not unjustified, I would say. But I think his books still stand out as his books are not contaminated by that. In his books, he treats his characters, I think, very, very fairly and, like I say, with enormous empathy. And they're well worth reading by anybody, regardless of your politics.
I certainly didn't get any hint of that on my read through.
Was that something you were aware of before you read the book?
No, in fact, until we were sitting here talking right this moment, I didn't know that Card was a controversial figure for any reason.
I am sorry to poison the well for you, but he is. He's
far from the first author that I enjoy their works, but would probably disagree with them if we were trying to have a beer together. All right, so that about wraps it up for Ender's Game. And again, I just want to thank you honestly for introducing me to this. This is a fantastic read, and I'm looking forward to the rest of the Enderverse.
Glad you enjoyed it. Yeah.
So join us in 2 weeks. The next book we will be tackling will be The Hobbit.
Favorite of both of ours.
Absolutely. This was my introduction to Tolkien, as I assume it was so many people's. And again, I like rollicking good reads, and this definitely qualifies.
Absolutely.
All right. See you in 2 weeks.